The need for enlightening of people in order to achieve the conditions of general prosperity and respect for the rights of women. Purpose of work. The role of constitution and criminal law for the realization of women's rights does not give the desired results. It only produces sporadic hypocritical restraint of violence, while it is not able to reform the mentality of the people. It requires an understanding of the causes of disrespecting the human personality and an enlightening effort to work on the reform of the mentality of people. Introduction. In order for a person to be able to be a blessing to society with their talents, it is necessary for that same society to provide them with conditions so that their sport, work and scientific abilities are recognized by that society as potential and actual blessings. And that is impossible if their elementary human rights are hindered under the strong influence of a certain ideology, religion, culture or tradition, which forces the ones who are loyal to them, and not the capable ones. Disrespect for another human being is the root of such suppression of human rights and conditions of prosperity. And that is our big historical problem. Throughout history, national, religious, ideological and gender differences have only provided reasons and excuses to humiliate the other party and prevent it from becoming a full member of the community with its talents. In the past, the age difference gave younger people the right to lapot, the ritual of physical extermination of older people. National and religious difference gave people excuses and reasons for persecution, robbery and even murder, which especially destroyed the economy of our country in the 19th century, because almost all the city's crafts and trade were in the hands of Turkic Serbs, Turks and Albanians, who were, in more on several occasions, expelled from the territory of Serbia freed from Turkish occupation. Later, expressions of disrespect continued to manifest themselves through ideological differences between people, so the bearers of the ruling ideology criminalized the latter and placed them in the group of unfit, depriving them of their civil rights to a large extent. And the difference between the sexes in these areas has always subordinated the female gender to the level of slave labor. Namely, in the patriarchal environment it was considered shameful for a man to do manual work, so all physical work, even the most difficult, remained in the hands of a woman. And as a special vulnerable group throughout all times of our history, there is a minority of those who were hated in society because their abilities exceeded the average. We live in a society that, with its mentality and culture, favors mediocrity while envying the more successful because it perceives them as an attack on its own personal pride and humiliates its own idea of value and greatness. In addition to envy and hatred towards everything that rises above the average, one of the still current problems is the position of the female person in our society. Although there is a great progress in respecting the rights of women, it is still far from what was expected. The number of women killed in domestic and intimate partner violence is still alarmingly high, which shows that neither constitutional rights nor strict legal regulations are able to fight against the culture and tradition that sees a woman as an inferior and subordinate partner. It is obvious that the repressive role of the state apparatus is not able, nor can it be expected, to eradicate evil at its root, although it shows the ability to restrain that evil in its manifestation to a certain extent. Therefore, efforts should be made in the direction of enlightening the people, which would lead to the removal of the causes of low respect for human beings globally, which will automatically produce respect for women as well as more successful individuals, so the whole society will be able to turn in the direction of prosperity. The role of tradition, ideology and religion is very important. So we will now analyze their influence on respect for human being, with special reference to the relationship of respect for female sex, because it is particularly exposed to bad influences. On the one hand, it is exposed to the influence of traditional patriarchy, which deprives a woman of her basic human rights, and on the other, to the influence of the West, which leads her to renounce her God-given responsibilities of service to family and society for the sake of personal narrow-minded hedonism. The temptation of Western influence. The emergence of Romanticism and the sexual revolution in the West produced generations of people unable to establish a healthy marital union, because to them the marital union itself seems like slavery, and marital responsibilities as an obstacle to personal hedonism. A marriage partner is no longer a goal, but only a temporary tool for one's own pleasure, and children, with their need to be brought up correctly, require effort and responsibility that parents are not ready to take on themselves. That is the reason why they do not raise a family, and if they raise one, they leave the upbringing of the children to negligence, thus producing in them a worse character than their own. In order to free man and woman from their God-given responsibilities, contemporary Western philosophy of life minimizes the differences between the male and female sexes, and tries to present this inability to recognize the different roles of the sexes in the human community as an expression of respect for the human personality. But we don't need a lot of wisdom to understand that it represents a flattering the weaknesses of people, who between the intention to respond to the real needs of the family and society with their abilities, and the intention to comply with the wishes of their unconquered ego, choose the latter. Although modern scientific knowledge reveals more than ever before the different abilities of the different sexes and their different place under the sun, the modern Western philosophy of life pretends to be blind to them and taboos its domain. Various scientific studies have found that female hormones yet in the prenatal development cause death, apoptosis, of brain cells which are in charge of male intellectual abilities, while testosterone in men destroys those brain cells which are responsible for female intellectual abilities. The result is, variously developed different types of intelligence between the different sexes. In order for a man not to be deconcentrated in his responsibility by those responsibilities which primarily are adequate to the female sex, his emotionality is, therefore, blocked in the development by male hormone testosterone. While a woman is more endowed with emotional intelligence which reveals her sphere of responsibility and guardianship, and those are the persons with whom she is directly close, a man more excels with abstract intelligence, issues of general significance that make him the source of the safety of his wife and family, and the source of justice in the human community. Therefore, completely purposefully to their place under the sun. To a woman is more important how she feels, and to a man is more important whether his work is valuable, powerful, significant and just. The capabilities of male and female sex complement each other. In the same stressful situation, woman will react with emotion of fear and defensively, in order to save her children, leaving the offensiveness to the male sex who is trained by the psychological and physical peculiarities in an aggressive defense of the family and society. In contemporary spiritual and moral decadence of humankind, each gender role is crippled, because the abuse of abilities for the sake of satisfaction, which is the root of gender immaturity, leads to a loss of function due to which this ability exists, so it is revealed also in the function of gender abilities. Emotionality, that should be the ability to express love, becomes a source of satisfaction, so people prefer the feelings that a loved one is causing to them, than her personality. A woman renounces her female responsibilities, child-raising and serving to her husband, because it humiliates her arrogance. She becomes arrogant to admit the dependence on a man in those spheres in which it is normal to build a complementary relationship with a man. That is why numerous expressions of tenderness, which were quite common in Western culture at the time of its greatest prosperity, bother her, because she understands them as a humiliation of her own arrogance. Also, a man renounces his male enterprising struggle for social justice and service to society and humanity, and becomes a coward and henpecked. He shifts his own responsibilities to the state, which explains why the level of testosterone in men is decreasing from year to year more and more. In such condition, both parents lose the motive of caring for their children because children disturb them in hedonism. In the end, a man loses the meaning of life, because the only true meaning of life, which permeates relations and living and non-living substances, is that he exists for the sake of other and serves the other. What is the role of religion in that process? The most inclined to divorce are the Protestants of the USA. They have a higher divorce rate than atheists. How is it possible? Modern Protestants tend to label their selfish human sentiment as the concept of love. By intoxicating with feelings in the relation with their partner and in the relation with their notion of God, they develop their selfish dependence on feelings to such an extent that even the slightest frustration of their desire for pleasure leads them to depression and disappointment in their partner or in God. When they leave their partner, they choose a new one, until they get bored of them, too. We see the negative influence of a religion that does not rebuke the desire for sin, so people enter marriage unprepared and immature, not to serve another person, but to satisfy their unconquered physical and emotional desires. The reason is this: modern Protestants reject much of the scripture and the very significance of God's law that rebukes sinful desires. The scriptures declare, "Do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh." Romans 13:14. The Quran states, "Have you, O Prophet, seen the one who takes his desire as his God? Will you then be a keeper over him?" Influence of patriarchal culture on the attitude toward women. It is a mistake to think that the solution to the contemporary crisis of marriage and family is a return to traditional patriarchal values. In the patriarchal upbringing in the Balkans, a woman was considered to be a lower being, on whom was placed the responsibility of all manual work that a man in his pride considered humiliating to perform. We read in anthropological reports, "For a Serb, it is unworthy work, to dig, to spin and to do all women's work, to light a fire, to carry water, to knead bread, to pour water on one's hands, to wash one's own feet and head, to comb one's hair alone, to do anything around small children." You can often see how women with heavy loads are dragged over rocks and mountains, while the husband goes empty-handed with a rifle on his shoulder and a pipe in his hand. Manual work was considered offensive for a man, so there was a sense in the stereotype that appeared about Montenegrins as a lazy, arrogant and warlike nation. Of course, the stereotype reflected the attitudes and behavior of men, but, on the other hand, the exploitation of women as beasts for carrying burden were immediately commented on. In such a society, where agricultural work is left to women, men's aversion to any work, other than that of a pastoral or military nature, was justified by the fact that it was considered offensive. Trade, like agriculture, was considered degrading. Since women did agricultural work, men had enough time, but they had neither the opportunity nor the inclination to use it productively. They also found it difficult to convert produce into cash, so interest in robbery increased. The same spirit of laziness and letting women do manual labor is seen in the description of Germans by the Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus. Nor are they as easily persuaded to plough the earth and to wait for the year's produce as to challenge an enemy and earn the honor of wounds. Nay, they actually think it tame and stupid to acquire by the sweat of toil what they might win by their blood. Whenever they are not fighting, they pass much of their time in the chase, and still more in idleness, giving themselves up to sleep and to feasting. The bravest and the most warlike doing nothing, and surrendering the management of the household, of the home, and of the land, to the women, the old men, and all the weakest members of the family. They themselves lie buried in sloth, a strange combination in their nature that the same men should be so fond of idleness, so averse to peace. However, Germans are no longer like that. In 1870, the historian and travel writer Juberman Enadovic recorded, "Germans are pious, industrious and moderate. Everywhere you see happy and content people. Nowhere do you see malice or envy. Everyone rejoices in others' welfare, everyone pities others' misfortune. German communities are so shaped and arranged, that it seems to you as if everyone lives just for the benefit and satisfaction of their fellowmen." Over a few short time spans, Germans achieved miracles, transformed their land into real paradise, a land Romans talked about as a Siberia, developed their industry, reformed the Roman faith, originated schools, sciences, laws, freedom, and with real enlightenment illuminated Middle Europe. Letters from Germany, 1874. The question arises, how did Germans manage to change their lazy and violent character that used to exploit women to do all the physical work? Negative influence of religion. Even the 1,000-year period of Catholicism did not succeed in reforming the character of the lazy and aggressive Germans, because the imposition of cultural values by the pressure of church and political power was a pressure that could only produce hypocrisy. Inventor and painter Samuel Morse described the attempt to enforce moral values among people through repression in the following words. Despotism often displays to shallow observers the exterior of justice on the part of the ruler, and the outside show of order and contentment on the part of the ruled. Yet look beneath the surface, and injustice, it will be seen, usually usurps the throne, and covers its oppressive decrees in mystery and darkness, while the oppressed people, restrained from complaint by physical force, are compelled to endure in silence, and smile while they suffer. Despotism is rank hypocrisy. Democracy is, at least, no hypocrite. It is honest and frank, and if there are occasions when its waywardness and folly offend, yet its whole character is open to view, and its irregularities can be checked and radically cured by enlightened public opinion. Samuel F. B. Morse. For 1,000 years, the Church, in a repressive way, maintained a hypocritical peace between peoples and nations. The result of such a spirit was fatal to the human personality. A person who, out of fear of punishment or shame, restrains his weaknesses from showing them, cannot stand those who openly show their weaknesses, because he would like to live like that himself, but cannot because of the fear of consequences. He would force that person through repression to the same hypocrisy under which he finds himself. That is why the Middle Ages were so dark, with a pronounced spirit of violence and the need to generate enemies. The human personality has sunk to such a low level, that entrusted freedoms were automatically abused, and every liberalization of government meant opening the door to anarchy. Only a strong authoritarian government managed to maintain a semblance of peace, but the government itself was never better than the people themselves, so the privilege of power was naturally abused. The authorities have legalized the right of the first wedding night. The famous psychologist Erich Fromm describes it as a feature of the Middle Ages. General lack of personal freedom, to the exploitation of the majority of the population by a small minority, to its narrowness which makes the peasant of the surrounding country a dangerous and suspected stranger to the city dweller. Not to speak of a person of another country, and to its superstitiousness and ignorance. What characterizes medieval in contrast to modern society is its lack of individual freedom. Everybody in the earlier period was chained to his rule in the social order. A man had little chance to move socially from one class to another. He was hardly able to move even geographically from one town or from one country to another. With few exceptions, he had to stay where he was born. He was often not even free to dress as he pleased or to eat what he liked. Erich Fromm, The Fear of Freedom. The Church was able to manipulate those nations who are prone to manipulation due to a pronounced feeling of guilt, or pride, by burdening them with guilt or pride, but over some nations it remained powerless. By awakening pride, the Church could motivate the Mediterranean peoples to respect certain manners of behavior. She could burden the peoples of Central Europe with formal rules of behavior by burdening them with guilt. But she was not able to manipulate the Germanic peoples as well as the peoples of the Western Balkans, whose nature has a pronounced untamed and barbaric character. Not only the arrogant rebellion, but also the natural reason of the northern peoples could not appreciate the forced external correctness and adherence to formal rules devoid of rational sense. They simply did not agree to be hypocrites. By promoting cultural values, a certain mentality can be manipulated, but it cannot be changed. It was necessary to convince people of the need to change their internal motives, and not to manipulate existing motives. Such an enlightening role had the teaching of Martin Luther, and it produced a change in the mentality of the Protestant nations. We need a change of mentality from the time of the Reformation again. Unlike the Church, which defined human behavior in every sphere of life with petty religious rules, the Protestant Reformation exalted God's moral law that meticulously rebuked the bad motives of the human heart. It freed believers from idolatry and rituals that served to deceive an unclean conscience. While the Church, with petty and blind rules of conduct, made an attack on the human personality because it entered into the responsibility of what is the sphere of the human personality itself. The Reformation counted on the fact that a person with a reformed heart, moved by love and cleansed of sin, knows for himself how and when he should behave, and that he does not need blind rules of conduct. Thus, the Reformation handed the responsibility for human behavior into the hands of the enlightened human personality, to his conscience and reason, which resulted in the maturation of the personality of both sexes and the prosperity of every kind. Then, for the first time, a woman took upon herself the responsibility that restored her own dignity and enabled her to provide such a blessing to humanity through her educational influence on future generations that was previously denied to her. because until then, the upbringing of children was entrusted to the streets and monasteries. The reform of mentality from the 16th to the 19th century was so great that even in the 17th century it produced a general respect for the human being, and it also changed the relationship of man toward animals. Movements and associations for the protection of animals are founded, and the literature claims that the one who is cruel to animals would also be cruel to people if he were not afraid of the consequences. Soon, the fruits of the reform are manifested in the relationship with other races, so slavery is abolished. Respect for the human being results in the formation of free public opinion and democracy. The attitude toward the female gender became based on such respect for the human personality that the wife and mother was considered a queen of the home, while her husband and children really treated her that way. French diplomat and writer Charles de Varigny published a book called The Women of the United States at the end of the 19th century. He wrote about the position of women in the previously enlightened patriarchy. In every place, public or private, at the theaters, in the hotels, in the railroad trains and on board steamers, in the restaurants and in the shops, in the streets and parks, in the drawing room and in her father's house, woman is queen. The Women of the United States by Charles de Varigny. The origin of such respect for a woman, Charles de Varigny sees in the influence of Reformation. The women were by no means lacking in boldness nor fearlessness, but it was not until the religious change which England brought about in passing from Catholicism to Protestantism that woman played an important part. She felt the influence of reform as did man. Christianity had given her liberty, but Protestantism freed her from further restraint. It gave her equal rights with man, it recognized even her natural intelligence, even her faculty of insight and of reason, and her duties and responsibilities in this life. She was free to live as she wished, even to marry as she wished. A feeling of limitless responsibility arose in place of her former passive obedience, and within her was born a strong and independent soul. She works and plans, and amid constant activity she satisfies one of the most urgent demands of her nature and of her heart, viz., to feel that she is the center of a home, and indispensable to those whom she loves. In the United States, woman is queen. The men builded, labored, planted, the women attended to their domestic duties. Their efforts were rewarded by a growing ease, by the comforts won through foresight and labor, by the knowledge of all trades which comes from the necessity of learning. Each year showed fresh progress, a wider domain, an increased harvest, a greater number of cattle, a growing prosperity in all things. Charles de Varigny. The change in the mentality of the people was global. Speaking about the ancient Vikings, known for their warrior spirit, the sources from the 18th century were explaining the causes of the reform of their mentality. How came they to be so docile and tractable as to submit to the arts of agriculture? Does a nation, habituated to arms and to idleness, easily give itself up to industry and the arts of peace? If we can answer this question aright, we shall know to what the happy transformation of the North is to be ascribed. I have yet shown that the gospel had now been for 3 centuries preached in Scandinavia. To this, doubtless, as the principal cause, we must attribute the happy alteration of manners in those barbarous regions. Christian godliness has the promise of the life that now is, as well as of that which is to come. While it conducts enslaved souls into liberty, and, turning them from the power of Satan to God, invests them with the garments of salvation, it also ameliorates their condition in this life, and diffuses through the world the most salutary precepts of peace, order, and tranquility. Let not men expect the general civilization of the globe by any other methods. We enjoy, at this day, the advantages of society derived to Europe, from the propagation of the gospel, while we ungratefully depreciate the labors of those Christian missionaries, through which, under God, those advantages were conveyed to us. The durable change of their manners intimates, that their country must have been blessed with one of those gracious effusions of the Holy Spirit, the consequences of which are commonly felt for ages after. The works of the late Reverend Joseph Milner. Peace has her habitation in our town, no quarrel, no hypocrisy, no envy, no strife. Benevolence is so great that the poor need not beg. The people admonish each other in brotherly fashion, as Christ prescribes. Lawsuits are banished from the city, nor is there any simony, murder, or party spirit, but only peace and charity. On the other hand, churches are quite free from all idolatry. So, although the patriarchy of the Protestant nations assigned to each gender the responsibilities that it was most suited to, it also restored to women their basic human rights and God-given dignity. But the West soon renounced its Enlightenment principles and embarked on a deep moral decadence. The attempt to preserve the achievements of the Reformation, no longer through the Enlightenment and moral revival of the people, but through the strong role of the state and its repressive solutions, returns the modern world to the level of civilization of the Middle Ages. The medieval fear of the all-seeing eye of God, which threatens the disobedient with eternal torment in hell, has today only been replaced by the fear of the all-seeing eye of the state apparatus, which records everything with its cameras and threatens the disobedient with criminal prosecution. Today, more than ever, we need the experience of internal reform of mentality because the role of the criminal law is symptomatic and does not solve the problem of evil at its root. Only when a person regains the spirit of respect for another human being in the world, the necessary respect for the female sex will also be restored.